You wake up, alarm, coffee, commute, 8 hours staring at a screen. Come home, eat, sleep, repeat. That's your life. That's most people's lives. And somewhere deep inside, you've probably had that thought, that quiet, rebellious little thought. What if I just didn't? What if there were no jobs, no boss, no deadlines, no performance reviews, no pretending to look busy when you've already finished your work an hour ago and you're now rearranging your desktop icons for the fourth time just to look occupied? Well, here's the thing. For the vast majority of human history, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years, that was just called being alive. Our ancestors didn't have jobs, they didn't have careers, they didn't have a LinkedIn profile saying, passionate about synergizing cross-functional value delivery. And somehow, against all odds, they managed to survive, thrive, create extraordinary things, and not spend their free time doom-scrolling through bad news they could do nothing about. So what did they actually do? Because this isn't just a fun historical curiosity. The answer to this question reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the world we've built, and something surprisingly beautiful about the world we lost. Let's start with the most important thing to understand, because almost everything you've been told about prehistoric life is wrong. You know the image. A gruff, dirty caveman dragging a club, grunting, barely surviving. Life was a relentless, desperate scramble for food, punctuated by violence, disease, and the constant looming threat of death. Every waking moment was consumed by survival. No time for anything else. No space for joy or creativity or leisure, just grim, exhausting, primitive existence. That phrase, nasty, brutish, and short, by the way, comes from a 17th century philosopher named Thomas Hobbes, who had never met a hunter-gatherer in his life and was mostly trying to justify why kings should have absolute power over everyone. So take that one with a planet-sized grain of salt. The reality, according to decades of anthropological research, is almost the complete opposite. Hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living window we have into prehistoric life, worked, on average, somewhere between 2 and 5 hours a day to meet all their basic needs. Food, water, shelter, done. The rest of the time, completely free. Let that sink in for a second. 2 to 5 hours. To survive. In a world without supermarkets, without running water, without electricity, without Amazon Prime delivering anything to your door within 24 hours. Meanwhile, the average person today works 8 to 10 hours. Plus commuting, plus all the invisible labor that comes with maintaining a modern life. Cooking, cleaning, admin, paying bills, filling out forms, dealing with the 17 different subscriptions you forgot you had, and still can't always make rent. The economist Marshall Solins famously called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. Not because they had a lot of stuff, they had almost no stuff. Deliberately so, actually, because stuff is heavy and you have to carry it when you move. But they had something far more valuable than stuff. They had time, a profound, radical abundance of time, which immediately raises the question, what on earth did they do with all of it? The answer, it turns out, is everything. And when I say everything, I mean specifically the things that make us human in the truest, deepest sense of the word. Not human as in productive economic unit. Human as in the thing you are at 2 a.m. talking to a close friend. Human as in the version of you that cries at music for no reason you can fully explain. Let's talk about the most obvious one first, social connection. Ancient humans were intensely social creatures. Not in a vague, performative, we're all connected social media way. In a visceral, physical, constant, unavoidable way. They lived in groups of roughly 20 to 50 people, and those relationships were the entire fabric of existence. Not background noise. The main event. The whole point. Knowing who you could trust, who was funny, who told the best stories, who was generous, who was petty, who was brave, who secretly hoarded the good berries, this knowledge was literally survival relevant. Your social intelligence was your most important skill. Getting along with people was not a soft skill. It was the hard skill, the only skill that really mattered in the long run. They talked, constantly, Anthropologists who have studied contemporary hunter-gatherer societies are consistently struck by just how much time is spent in conversation. Not productive conversation, not meetings, not status updates. Just talk. And what do people talk about when left to their own devices with all the time in the world? Mostly each other. Who did what? Who said what to whom? Who's in a weird mood? The social drama, the gossip, the gentle, constant monitoring of the group's emotional temperature. Robin Dunbar, the evolutionary psychologist who gave us the famous Dunbar's number. The idea that humans can maintain roughly 150 meaningful relationships argued that language itself evolved primarily as a form of social grooming. Words as a replacement for the physical grooming that other primates do. Picking bugs out of each other's fur. Maintaining bonds through touch. We got too numerous and too busy for that, so we replaced it with talking. Which means that every group chat, every long phone call, every conversation that somehow lasts 3 hours and covers absolutely nothing of practical importance. That is ancient, primal, necessary behavior. You're not wasting time. You're being human. But conversation was only part of it. Music was everywhere. Flutes made from vulture bones and mammoth ivory have been found in caves in Germany, dating back 40,000 years. To put that in perspective, writing was invented about 5,000 years ago. Agriculture about 10,000. Whatever language these people spoke, whatever they ate, however they organized their lives, long before any of that, they made music. And this wasn't performance. There was no stage, no audience, no streaming numbers to check, no wondering whether the algorithm would push your song. It was communal, spontaneous, entirely participatory. Everyone was in the band. If you wanted to hear music, you made music. The idea that some people are musical, and most aren't, is a modern invention, a byproduct of professionalization and specialization. In small-scale societies, music making was as universal as walking. They sang while they worked. They drummed around fires. They danced. Not as performance, but as group synchronization. As a way of physically aligning bodies and nervous systems, generating collective states that modern neuroscience has only recently started to understand and take seriously. Think about that compared to now, where most people consume music entirely passively through earbuds, alone, as background to other activities. Where the very idea of just spontaneously singing out loud in public feels embarrassing and weird. Where dancing without alcohol involved requires a level of social confidence that most people just don't have anymore. Our ancestors would find that baffling, possibly a little sad. Then there's art. The cave paintings of Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, Chauvet. These aren't primitive scribbles. They are extraordinary. The horses of Chauvet are so anatomically precise, so dynamically rendered, with such a sophisticated understanding of movement and three-dimensionality, that when Werner Herzog first saw them up close, he said they looked like they could have been painted yesterday, by someone who really knew what they were doing. They are 36,000 years old. These weren't decorations. The placement of many cave paintings deep inside cave systems, in near total darkness, in narrow passages, in spaces requiring real effort and risk to reach, suggests ritual, ceremony, intention, something like religion, or at least what religion eventually grew from, a need to make the invisible visible, to reach beyond the immediate and touch something larger. Ancient humans were not just surviving. They were reaching for meaning. That impulse, it turns out, is not new. It is not a luxury of civilization. It is as old as we are. Let's talk about play, because this one genuinely surprises people. Play is not a modern invention. It is not a privilege of the wealthy or the leisured class. It is one of the most fundamental behaviors in social mammals, and in humans, it extends far beyond childhood into the whole of life. Hunter-gatherer societies show substantial amounts of adult play. Games, physical contests, jokes, elaborate and often savage pranks, storytelling competitions, teasing, games of skill and chance. The Takungsan people of southern Africa, one of the most extensively studied hunter-gatherer groups, are described by anthropologists as having a culture that is relentlessly, almost aggressively playful. There is a powerful social norm against taking yourself too seriously. Status and rank, the kind that produces hierarchy, are actively resisted. If someone returns from a successful hunt acting even slightly proud of themselves, the group will immediately begin to mock them, warmly but persistently, until they deflate back to normal. They called this insulting the meat. A hunter brings back a huge, impressive kill. Instead of congratulating him, everyone begins to comment on how disappointing it looks, how thin, how underwhelming, how they've honestly seen better. The hunter is expected to agree, to laugh, to say, "Yeah, it's pretty pathetic. Sorry about that." This is not just funny. This is a sophisticated social technology. It's a distributed, organic mechanism for maintaining equality, for ensuring that success doesn't translate into ego, that ego doesn't translate into dominance, that dominance doesn't translate into the early stages of hierarchy that eventually produces kings, aristocrats, and people who own yachts while others can't pay medical bills. Laughter, in this light, is not just entertainment. It's governance. Sleep, too, looked completely different. And this one has real implications for how you feel every single night. Before artificial light, before the industrial work schedule, before the alarm clock decided on your behalf when you were allowed to be unconscious, humans did not sleep in one solid 8-hour block. The idea that you should go to bed at 10, sleep straight through to 6, and feel refreshed is not ancient wisdom. It is a relatively recent invention, one that fits the factory schedule more than it fits human biology. Historian Roger Ekirch spent 16 years systematically going through historical documents, diaries, medical texts, court records, literature across centuries and cultures, and found thousands of references to a completely different sleep pattern. First sleep, a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. Second sleep. This waking period, typically lasting an hour or so around midnight, was not considered a problem. It was not called insomnia. It was expected, recognized, and used. People would get up, talk to their partners, pray, read, write, have sex, think through problems. Neighbors would visit each other. It was described in historical sources as a time of unusual calm and mental clarity, a window of reflective consciousness between two periods of sleep that modern life has entirely bulldozed with artificial light and early morning obligations. Modern sleep researchers have actually reproduced this pattern in experiments. When people are kept in conditions of natural darkness for extended periods, with no artificial light, they spontaneously revert to exactly this biphasic pattern. The midnight wakefulness reappears on its own, and they report that the quality of consciousness during this period feels different, softer, more open, more reflective, associated with elevated levels of prolactin, the same hormone that promotes a calm, dreamy state in nursing mothers. That thing you call insomnia, that maddening inability to sleep in one clean block, might not be a malfunction. It might be your 300,000-year-old biological program trying to reassert itself against a schedule that was designed for shift workers, not humans. Now, here's something that tends to genuinely disturb people when they first encounter it. Ancient humans may have actually worked less and eaten better than many of the farmers who came after them. This is one of the more jarring revelations of modern anthropology. When humans transitioned from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to agriculture, roughly 10,000 years ago, something unexpected shows up in the archaeological record. Skeletons change. Teeth deteriorate. Bones show increased signs of nutritional deficiency and disease. Average height decreases noticeably. And height in historical populations is a reliable proxy for overall health and nutrition. Infant mortality increases. Spines begin to show evidence of repetitive strain from the specific postures of agricultural work. Crouching, bending, grinding grain by hand for hours. The early farmers worked harder, ate a narrower range of foods, suffered more disease, had shorter lives, and experienced more physical deterioration than the hunter-gatherers they replaced or became. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus allowed for the first time the storage of food beyond immediate needs. That storage created the possibility of inequality, of some people controlling more than others. That inequality enabled hierarchy. And hierarchy enabled cities, and cities enabled writing. And writing enabled the accumulation and transmission of knowledge at scales never before possible. From that chain comes mathematics, philosophy, science, medicine, technology, everything we broadly call civilization. But for the individual person living through that first transition, eating wheat porridge instead of a diverse diet of dozens of wild plants and animals, spending 10 hours a day bent over a field instead of a few hours foraging through a landscape you'd known since childhood, it was not obviously an improvement in quality of life. Jared Diamond famously called agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. That's too strong. The things that grew from it are genuinely extraordinary. But the point stands that the story of human progress is not a clean upward line from primitive misery to modern comfort. It involves trade-offs that we are still, 10,000 years later, not entirely sure were worth it. Let's talk about learning, because this is where things get genuinely beautiful in a way that tends to stick with people. In the absence of formal education, no schools, no textbooks, no standardized tests designed to measure your ability to sit still and repeat information, how did ancient humans learn? How was knowledge, essential survival knowledge, passed reliably across generations? Stories. Everything was stories. The stars were stories. The animals were stories. The rivers, the mountains, the seasons. All encoded in narrative, in myth, in song that could be remembered and repeated. Knowledge that needed to survive across generations was wrapped in emotionally resonant, memorable narrative and passed mouth to ear, around fires, in the dark, until it became something closer to instinct than information. And this was not a primitive workaround for the absence of writing. It was a genuinely sophisticated technology for long-term knowledge preservation, and in some respects it outperforms text. Indigenous Australian cultures carry oral traditions that appear to accurately describe real geological events, volcanic eruptions, dramatic coastal changes from rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. The stories are that old. They survived intact across 400 generations without a single written word, because they were attached to landscape, to ceremony, to community, because they were alive. Your ancestors didn't have libraries. They had elders. And sitting with an elder, listening, watching, asking questions, absorbing not just information but judgment and perspective, was education in the fullest sense. The knowledge transmitted wasn't just facts. It was wisdom. How to read a landscape that's about to change. How to understand what weather is really telling you. How to navigate a complex social situation without destroying the relationships you depend on for survival. How to face pain, how to face loss, how to face death, with something other than panic. There are things that cannot be put in a textbook. Things that can only move through presence, through relationship, through story. Our ancestors understood this not as a philosophy, but as a simple, practical reality. We've largely forgotten it. And then there was ceremony, ritual, the deliberate marking of time, birth, death, the first hunt, the onset of adolescence, recovery from illness, the change of seasons, the return of rain. Ancient humans marked these moments, not as entertainment, not because they had nothing better to do, but because marking transitions is one of the most fundamental human needs there is, and ignoring it has a cost. We still do this, of course. Weddings, funerals, graduations, birthdays. The underlying need has not gone anywhere. But consider how stripped down and often perfunctory our ceremonies have become. A hunter-gatherer coming-of-age ritual might involve extended preparation, fasting, physical challenge, days of storytelling, the participation of the entire community, and a moment of profound personal transformation that was witnessed and validated by everyone who knew you. You came through it different. You were recognized as different. The community reorganized itself around you being different. That recognition was real, was felt, was social. Compare that to turning 18 and getting a card from your bank saying you're now eligible for a credit card. Different energy. This is not nostalgia. The point is not that ancient life was better across the board. The infant mortality alone should dispel any romanticization. Injuries that are trivial today were often fatal. Childbirth was genuinely terrifying. Droughts, famines, bad winters. The margin for error was thin in a way that most of us in the modern world have no real frame of reference for. But the texture of daily life, the rhythm of it, the social density of it, the meaning woven through even ordinary moments, that was something. And we have traded it away, gradually and largely without noticing, in the relentless optimization for productivity, efficiency, and economic output. Here's the uncomfortable mirror this whole history holds up to the present. We live in a society that defines people almost entirely by their economic productivity. What do you do? That's often the first question we ask each other. Not who are you, not what do you love. What do you do? Meaning, how do you convert your hours into money? Your identity is inseparable from your function in the economic machine. Ancient humans had no such framework. A person was defined by their relationships, their knowledge, their skills, their role in the community, their reputation for generosity or courage or humor. The best storyteller, the most knowledgeable healer, the person who always knew where to find water. These were the people who held status, not people who generated the highest return on investment. When early anthropologists asked hunter-gatherers what they did, many gave answers that confused and frustrated their interviewers. They described activities, places, relationships, seasons. They didn't have a word that translated cleanly as job because the concept of separating work time from living time simply did not exist in their mental universe. You gathered food because you were hungry, because you knew where to find it, because you went with people you loved through a landscape you knew as intimately as your own body. Was that work? Was it leisure? The question would have been incomprehensible. Now look at the present. An epidemic of burnout in the wealthiest countries in recorded history. A loneliness crisis so significant that multiple governments have appointed ministers specifically to address it. Rising rates of anxiety and depression in populations that are, by any material standard, safer and more comfortable than any humans who ever lived. A widespread, persistent, difficult to articulate feeling that something essential is missing, even when all the boxes are checked. Maybe the problem is not that we're weak or ungrateful or doing something wrong. Maybe the problem is structural. Maybe we have built a world optimized for economic productivity that runs in direct contradiction to the actual operating requirements of the species that has to live in it. So, what did ancient humans do without jobs? They talked for hours about nothing important and everything that mattered. They made music without audiences. They painted animals on cave walls in the dark. They played games and insulted each other's hunting and laughed until their sides hurt. They learned the stars and the seasons and the silent language of animals from people who had learned it from people who had learned it from people going back further than memory reached. They slept in two pieces with a dreaming gap in the middle of the night. They marked the passing of time with ceremony that involved everyone and changed you. They raised children in groups of adults who all knew them. They sat with their dying and helped them leave with dignity. They were, by many reasonable definitions of the word, free. Not free from hardship, not free from grief or illness or loss, but free in the sense that their time was their own, that their lives were organized around relationships and meaning rather than schedules and output, that the question, what's the point of all this, was answered every single day, not deferred to some future retirement they might not live to see. And the reason this question matters, the reason it's worth sitting with, really sitting with, is not because we can go back. We can't. There are 8 billion people on this planet. Agriculture and cities and industry are not optional extras. The world we've built is the only one we have. But understanding what human life looked like before productivity became a moral virtue, before the alarm clock decided when you were allowed to exist, before your value as a person became inseparable from your economic output, that understanding is a kind of compass. It points toward what we actually need underneath all the noise: real conversation, music made together, ritual and meaning, rest that actually restores, time that belongs to you. You are not lazy for wanting those things. You are not broken for struggling in a world that systematically denies them. You're just old. 300,000 years old to be precise. and some part of you still remembers.